Some nights in nowhere are quieter than others. Not because the wind has stopped, or because the moon has hidden itself, but because the world simply decides to rest. In the old farmhouse, the clock ticks like it's in no hurry. A floorboard sighs now and then, but not enough to wake anyone. Muriel sleeps peacefully in her chair, a knitted blanket rising and falling with each breath. Even Eustace, stubborn, grumbling Eustace, lets out a snore that's softer than usual. And in the corner, on his little bed, Courage lies awake. Not scared, not exactly, just thinking. He thinks about all the days and nights that came before. The storms, the strange visitors, the things that tried to frighten him, the shadows that spoke, and the ones that stayed silent. Most of the time, the memories are loud, full of shouting, running, doors slamming, and his own trembling heart. But every now and then, another kind of memory drifts in. The rare ones, the ones so quiet, so unexpected, that they almost feel like they came from another life entirely. Moments that didn't seem important at the time, but stayed with him, tucked away like a folded note in the pocket of an old coat. Courage shifts under his blanket, his ears twitching at the distant hum of the windmill outside. His mind begins to wander, and the edges of his memories blur into dreams. What were those moments, really? Why did they stay? And if they were so rare, will they ever come again? Tonight we'll drift with Courage through each of them. One by one, slowly, like pages in a book. You don't want to finish too quickly. But first, tell me, if you had just one rare moment to keep forever, would you choose the one where someone finally showed they cared? Or the one where you realized you were braver than you thought? The first rare moment is the day Eustace smiled. The afternoon in nowhere stretched out like a sleepy yawn. The kind of day where even the dust in the sunlight seemed to float slower. The sun hung low in the sky, spilling gold through the farmhouse windows. Its light settled on the old floorboards, warm under Courage's paws. In the kitchen, Muriel's gentle humming floated in and out of the air like a lullaby. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the living room, carrying with it the comfort of home. Eustace sat in his chair by the window, not reading the paper, not shouting about chores, not muttering under his breath, just staring out across the dry fields, his eyes following something Courage couldn't see. Courage lingered at the doorway, paws pressed into the worn rug. Something felt different. The air didn't have its usual edge. The room felt still, but not in a scary way. He tilted his head, curious, hesitant. For once Eustace didn't notice him, or maybe he did, but chose not to say anything. And in that pause, Courage took a small, careful step forward. The silence between them was rare. Not the sharp silence of an argument, not the tense quiet of something waiting to go wrong. This was soft. Eustace's gaze shifted, his head turning just slightly toward Courage. Not annoyed, not impatient, just looking. Courage felt his ears twitch. He glanced away, pretending to paw at the rug like it was the most important thing in the world. The clock on the wall ticked. 1, 2, 3 beats of time, before Eustace leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands hung loosely, not clenched, not fidgeting. The air between them felt lighter, like someone had opened a window in winter and let in fresh air. It was still the same old room, but the weight it carried most days seemed gone. Courage's chest rose and fell slowly. He stayed put. Courage sat down at Eustace's feet, not because he was told to, and not because he was hiding, just because it felt right. The way the light stretched across the floor, the way Eustace's boots were planted steady instead of stomping. It felt like a safe place to be. Eustace's eyes drifted downward. They didn't sharpen into a glare like usual. There was no muttering about stupid dog. He didn't say a word, but his posture shifted, just slightly, like he was making room for Courage without thinking about it. Courage's tail flicked once against the floor, not wagging, not still, something in between, the space where curiosity and calm meet. And then, it happened. Eustace's mouth curved upward, not the crooked smirk that meant trouble, not the grin that came from scaring Courage half to death. This was smaller, quieter, almost shy. It lasted only a second, maybe less, but to Courage, It was as bright as sunlight after a week of storms. He blinked, unsure if he'd imagined it. But no, it was real. The smile said nothing, yet it said everything. A fleeting warmth that didn't need words to be understood. Eustace leaned back in his chair, looking toward the window again. The smile was gone. Or maybe hidden. Muriel's humming continued, steady and warm. The bread scent filled the room, mixing with the faint smell of dust and sunshine. Courage stayed at his feet, not daring to move, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want to lose the moment. Outside, the sky deepened to orange, the kind of glow that comes just before the first stars appear. The windmill turned lazily, groaning like an old friend. Everything seemed to slow, as if time itself was pausing to let this memory settle in. Later that night, Courage lay curled in his bed. The room was dark, except for the faint moonlight spilling through the curtains. He closed his eyes, replaying the moment over and over. The way Eustace looked at him, the slight shift forward, the small, quiet smile. He wondered why it happened. Was it something Courage had done, or was it simply a rare crack in Eustace's armor? Courage knew he might never get another one, but that didn't matter. Tonight he carried that warmth with him, a soft glow tucked deep inside, ready to be taken out on the coldest nights, when the storms were loud and the shadows were close. And in that safe thought, Courage drifted into sleep. Night had settled over nowhere, like a heavy blanket. The stars outside blinked lazily, and the air was cool against the farmhouse walls. In the kitchen, a single warm light spilled across the counter. The rest of the house stayed dim, shadows tucked into every corner. Muriel stood by the stove, her hands busy with nothing urgent, stirring a small pot, not because anyone was hungry, but because she liked the way the steam curled upward. And then, she began to hum, not her usual tune for passing the time, not the soft melodies she used when baking, but something slower, older. The sound drifted into the hallway, through the open door, and found Courage sitting by his bed. His ears twitched. This wasn't just background music for the house. It felt like it was meant for him. No television noise, no chores to do, just her voice, soft and steady, wrapping around him like a blanket he didn't have to hold. Courage sat still for a long moment, letting the tune wrap itself around him. It was soft, almost like the sound of a dream you didn't want to wake from. Slowly, he rose from his little bed, his paws pressed gently against the worn rug, the threads remembering the shape of his steps. The hallway was dim, lit only by the glow spilling from the kitchen doorway. He followed the sound, the hum of Muriel's voice, floating between each careful footstep. She didn't stop when he reached the doorway. She didn't even turn her head, as if she already knew he was there. And the song was his invitation. Courage sat on the edge of the kitchen tile, his ears tilted forward, eyes half-lidded as the tune swayed in the warm air. It was different from the noise of the day. No wind rattling the windows, no far-off howl in the fields, just the sound of Muriel's voice, and the soft creak of the rocking chair behind her. Muriel finished stirring, and moved slowly to her chair. The floor beneath her gave a friendly groan, the same sound it had made for decades under her steps. She settled into the rocking chair by the window, the fabric of her dress whispering against the cushion. Her humming didn't falter. Each note flowed into the next, like water running over smooth stones. Courage curled up just a few feet away, paws tucked under him, tail wrapped close. The glow from the kitchen lamp painted her in gold, the edges of her figure soft against the shadowed walls. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the farmhouse gently, as though it didn't want to interrupt. Courage let his eyes drift shut halfway. Every breath Muriel took between the notes was as familiar to him as the scent of home. For once, there was no need to listen for danger, no need to keep one ear open for trouble. Tonight, the only sound worth hearing was the song she hummed, just for him. After a while, Courage rose from his spot on the cool tile. He padded closer, paws making the faintest thuds on the worn wooden floor. Muriel glanced down for just a moment, her eyes soft, her smile small, and then she kept on humming, her hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair. Courage sat right beside her now, close enough to feel the slow sway of the chair under her weight. Every time she rocked forward, her skirt brushed the tip of his fur. He could hear the sound of her breathing beneath the tune, a slow, steady rhythm, like the ticking of a clock that would never stop. Muriel reached down absent-mindedly, letting her fingers run gently over his back. The humming softened even further, the notes stretching out like warm honey. Courage closed his eyes completely. The world outside the kitchen no longer existed. No wind, no cold, no shadows, just this moment, where each breath she took, and each note she hummed, felt like they belonged to him alone. Courage lay down fully now, head resting on his paws, eyes shut as the song filled the room like warm light. The tune was simple, yet it seemed to carry more than just notes. Each rise and fall of her voice pulled at something tucked deep inside him. He thought of the first day Muriel picked him up from the cold street, wrapping him in her scarf to shield him from the wind. He remembered the way her hands were always gentle, even when the world wasn't. The melody curved and bent like a path he'd walked before, winding through nights when storms howled at the windows, and she would hum to keep him from shaking. Outside, a low breeze rattled the trees, but it couldn't break through the warmth inside the kitchen. The rocking chair swayed. The hum continued, each note sewing itself into the fabric of his memory. Courage's breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of her song. This wasn't just a lullaby. It was a promise that no matter what came tomorrow, tonight, he was safe. The kitchen felt even warmer now, though the stove had gone quiet. The glow from the lamp was the only light left in the house, wrapping the room in gold. Muriel's humming slowed, each note stretching further apart, as if she were rocking the song itself to sleep. Courage shifted closer, his side resting gently against her slippered foot. She didn't stop humming, not until his breathing had grown deep and steady, and his body had gone soft with the weight of rest. Outside, the windmill turned lazily, each groan of its blades further away than the last. The fields beyond were silent, the stars blinking their slow, patient light. Muriel gave one last soft hum, the kind that fades like the end of a story. Her hand rested on Courage's back, and she whispered something he couldn't quite hear, but didn't need to, because he already knew. He would carry that song with him into sleep, into dreams, and into the quiet places of tomorrow, where it would stay, just as warm. Nowhere held its breath that night. The sky felt too big, the ground too empty, and the wind carried stories Courage didn't want to hear. He ran, then stopped, then ran again. Not far, not fast, just enough to keep the shadows behind him, instead of beside him. His paws patted over the dry earth, then over the wooden porch, then back onto the yard, when the porch felt louder than the wind. Inside the farmhouse, Muriel had fallen asleep with her knitting on her lap. Eustace snored softly, a stubborn rhythm that said the world could fuss and fret all it liked. He would not. But outside, something moved where things shouldn't move. A shape too tall for a scarecrow, too thin for a man, too quiet for a coyote. Courage swallowed, and pressed himself against the side of the house, feeling the boards cool against his fur. The windmill turned once, twice, and then paused as if listening. The shape leaned, then straightened, then leaned again, searching. It didn't roar, it didn't scrape, it looked. Courage tried to make himself small. He told his breath to be quiet, and his heart to be kinder. The shape took a step, and the earth seemed to forget how to hold sound. Another step, another silence. Run, his legs said. Listen, his ears said. Wait, said something softer, somewhere in the middle of him. The wind skimmed across the yard, nudging the door to the tool shed until it tapped, 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 like a shy knock. Courage slid toward it, squeezing through the gap, letting the dark of old shovels and older memories wrap around him. In here, time thinned. He could count the seconds between the windmill's groans, could hear the grain settle in the feed bin, could map his fear to the gentle dust floating through the lamplight crack in the door. Outside, The shape stopped. For a long time, nothing happened. And then, from the empty field, a sound that wasn't a growl, wasn't a howl, wasn't a threat. It was a breath, a shivering, unsteady breath. Courage's ears lifted. He didn't move. He just listened to the night that wouldn't end. The fields behind the farmhouse were a maze, even when the sun was kind. At night, each row of corn became a corridor, each tassel a whispering hand, pointing both ways at once. Courage slipped between the rows, letting the leaves brush his shoulders, letting the ground tell him where it had been stepped on before. The breath came again, closer now, a trembling inhale, a careful exhale. Not hunting, holding on. He crept along the furrow's edge, and peered through a split in the stalks. There, where the field opened to a clearing, the tall shape bent over itself, as if the night were too heavy to carry. Courage's fear came, as it always did, quick and sharp and honest. He felt it in his paws, in his chest, in the part of his mind that kept every exit memorized. He also felt something else, a pause, a hush that wasn't empty. The shape lifted its head. The face, if it had a face, was more shadow than skin, more outline than feature. But near where a mouth would be, the air trembled, like someone trying not to cry. Courage sank onto his belly, letting the earth cool him. He didn't leave. He didn't bark. He didn't call for Muriel, because the sound that kept reaching him didn't feel like something you protected yourself from, but something you protected for. The wind laid down and grew very small. Even the windmill far behind him now kept its voice low. "It's okay," Courage didn't say. But the way he stayed made the shape look up. The monster, if monster was the right word, turned as if it could hear the quiet he was offering. It didn't step forward. It didn't reach out. It breathed again, shaky, trying. Courage shuffled an inch closer, and let the corn make the sounds he couldn't. A rustle like a blanket being pulled to someone's chin. A hush, like the last word before sleep. He'd met things in nowhere that looked like fear, and wore it like a costume. This one wore something else, a heaviness that didn't know its own weight. Courage rose, and took 2 steps into the clearing. The tall shape flinched so hard, the corn shivered. Not angry, afraid. Courage stopped, sat, put his paws neatly together, like Muriel had taught him, when guests came over. Long moments passed. The monster's outline steadied. The night let itself be counted again. 1 cricket, 1 leaf, 1 heartbeat, another. Up close, the dark around the monster wasn't empty. It was thin, torn at the edges, as if it had been scraped by too many rough nights. Courage lowered his head. He knew that feeling. Carefully, carefully, he scooted until he and the shadow shared the same patch of dirt. Not touching, but close enough that if either of them breathed too deeply, they might. The shape tried for a sound. It came out wrong at first, like a door that hasn't been opened in years. Then softer still. A word tried to happen, and failed. Another tried, and found half its letters. Courage didn't rush it. He let his own breathing be a metronome. In out, in out. He thought of Muriel's hands when he shook, how she would keep them still, so he could borrow their steadiness. The shape leaned a fraction. The night leaned with it. Look began, the sound breaking like a twig underfoot. Not a threat, not a spell. The attempt alone was brave enough to quiet a mile of corn. Courage stood, and did something simple. He turned his body toward home and waited. The monster didn't know how to follow. Not like this. It hovered inside itself, learning where to put the next moment. Courage took 1 step, then stopped. He looked back with his whole body, not just his head. The way Muriel looked at him, when she wanted him close. Another step, another pause. The shape shifted, as if discovering it had a direction. It didn't crunch the stalks, or shake the earth. It floated the way heavy feelings sometimes do. Enormous but quiet, full of their own weather. They moved together through the rows, Courage keeping a small dog-sized pace, so the night could keep up. At the field's edge, he found the old lantern hanging from the fence post. No oil, no flame. Still, when he nosed it, the glass chimed a little note that said, "I remember light." The monster tilted, listening to the memory. Its outline smoothed at the corners, as if one bad hour had been sanded down. Past the fence, the yard stretched open, sagebrush and starlight, and the line of the porch, where stories ended and safety began. Courage paused at the bottom step. He didn't go in. He didn't wake Muriel. He stood in the kind of doorway that isn't made of wood. The place between fear and not fear. He had stood here many times. Behind him, the tall shape folded itself smaller, like a coat being draped over the back of a chair. The windmill turned once, and the squeak sounded almost like a lullaby. Courage sat. The monster sat with him, or did the closest thing to sitting it knew how to do. Minutes thinned. The stars breathed. No one rushed the night. Dawn didn't break. It arrived. The sky turned the color of warm milk, and the edges of things softened, until everything looked like it might forgive everything else. The monster, smaller now, somehow, lifted the place where a face might be, and let the new light touch it. For the first time since the field, a word made it all the way through. Not loud, not clear, but whole. Thank you. The syllables were heavy but kind, as if they had been carried a long way, and were happy to finally be put down. Courage's ears flicked. He didn't wag. He didn't bark. He just let the words land. The shape's edges went thin as dew. The porch step, the fence post, the knot in the yard's one good tree could be seen through it now. Like memories you can still touch, but can't quite hold. You're okay. Courage didn't say, out loud, but something in the way he breathed replied for him. The monster dipped, a bow, or a nod, or the motion of a tide going in. Then the space it took up became space again. The yard filled the absence like a friend, taking your hand. The windmill turned, and didn't need to explain anything. Courage pushed the door with his nose, and climbed onto the kitchen rug. Muriel was there already, hair pinned, eyes soft with morning. There you are, dear, she said in the voice that made both the room and the day decide to be kind. She didn't ask about the night, because sometimes the asking is heavier than the telling. She poured water into a cup, and let the steam draw shapes on the air. Courage sat, and watched the window. The yard beyond it was ordinary again. Fence, grass, the stubborn shape of Eustace's hat on its peg as he shuffled in, grumbling at the brightness. Ordinary, and forever changed in a way only Courage could feel. He thought about the word that had arrived at the porch steps. Thank you. He turned it over in his mind, like a small smooth stone. Was the monster real? Did it matter? Some things in nowhere were as real as fear, and as invisible as kindness. They came heavy, left light, and taught you how to hold both. Muriel set a saucer on the floor, with a little splash of warm milk, the kind of generous mistake she made on purpose. There now, she murmured. Long night. Courage blinked slow. He pressed his side to the cabinet, where her hand might find him if it wandered. The wind outside remembered how to be only wind. The fields remembered how to be only fields. The word remembered how to live inside a heartbeat, without needing a mouth. Courage closed his eyes for a moment. That could have been a minute or an hour. He saw the clearing, the thinning edges, the bow that looked like the sea turning. You're welcome, he didn't say, but the way the day began, gentle, ordinary, forgiven, said it for him. And somewhere just at the edge of listening, the yard gave its answer back. A breath, not quite a breeze, the softest possible reply, like a thank you finding its home. Some nights in nowhere breathe in, and forget to breathe out. This was one of those nights. The sky leaned low. The fields swayed like a sleepy thought. And then, the wind paused. Not gone. Not broken. Just paused. Inside the farmhouse, a clock ticked like a heartbeat, learning a slower song. Courage lifted his head, his ears tilted, listening to the space the wind left behind. The floorboards remembered every step taken on them, and decided not to squeak. Muriel slept in her chair, the knitted blanket rising and falling, soft as a lullaby that hums itself. Eustace snored once, then turned, then settled into that stubborn quiet that said the world could wait. Courage stood, his paws barely whispering against the rug. Silence can be heavy. Tonight it was gentle. He padded to the doorway, where the hall meets the kitchen, the seam where day things sleep, and night things tell their stories. The windmill turned once, twice, then decided even creaking was too loud. Courage felt the quiet on his fur like cool water. He didn't shake it off, he wore it. Somewhere beyond the yard, the grass forgot how to sway. The fence forgot how to rattle. The world listened. He counted what wasn't there. No whistle through the window seams. No dry leaf tumbling across the porch. No distant coyote gossiping with the moon. In the absence, small things stepped forward. The click between ticks on the clock. The hush of his own breath. The soft slide of a curtain, settling one thread lower. He checked on Muriel. The blanket kept its promise. Her slipper toe peeked from beneath, nodding with each breath. Courage put his paw near it, close enough to borrow her rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The quiet matched them, like the night was learning to breathe with the house. He nudged the back door open. Outside, the yard held still, like a photograph pinned to the dark. The sagebrush stood politely. The water trough forgot to ripple. Even the moths seemed to hover in the thought of movement, instead of the doing of it. The porch boards accepted his weight, and said nothing. He looked up at the windmill, that tall, stubborn friend who always had something to say. Tonight it bowed its head, and rested. They understood each other. Finally, even guardians need a quiet minute. There's a place between wind and no wind, between noise and hush, a thin doorway made of waiting. Courage stood right there, not forward, not back, just present, like a lantern with no flame that still remembers light. Why did the wind go quiet? Was it hiding, healing, holding something delicate so it wouldn't break? Courage didn't ask out loud. Questions sound louder in stillness. He simply listened the way Muriel listens, with patience warm enough to make answers come closer on their own. Somewhere, a star slipped behind a softer cloud. Somewhere, a worry put itself down. Courage made a slow circle of the yard, past the fence post with the smooth spot shaped like a hand, past the trough that kept moonlight like a secret, past the shed door that used to tap, now resting its knuckles. Every landmark reported in all is well. All is still. All is listening. He returned to the porch, sat, let the hush sit with him. The wind did not come back. Not yet. Courage looked at the fields that forgot to move, and felt something new, peace that didn't need proof. He closed his eyes, only a little, and kept watch with the quiet, until the quiet felt brave enough to keep watch with him. The quiet stayed. It sat across the yard like an old friend who wasn't in a hurry to speak. Courage kept his ears forward, not straining, just open. The grass at the far edge of the field stood tall, each blade like a soldier at rest, not stiff, not tense, just still in a way that said, "We're listening too." He stepped off the porch. The ground was cool under his paws, but not cold enough to bite. It was the kind of cool that wakes you gently, the way Muriel would open a window just an inch on spring nights. He walked toward the fence, each paw print pressing into the soil without a sound. No twig snapped, no pebbles shifted. Even his breathing seemed to match the quiet pace of the night. At the fence post he paused. It was smooth in the middle, worn down by years of leaning hands. Muriel's when she watched the sunset, Eustace's when he checked the weather, and Courage's when he made sure the world was behaving. He pressed his shoulder against it, and for a moment it felt like leaning on something that had been leaning on you all along. Beyond the fence, the field stretched out, silver with moonlight. Usually, it would be dancing, blades of grass swaying in conversation with the wind. But tonight it was as though the whole field had turned its face upward, waiting for something to arrive. Courage tilted his head. The night tilted with him. A cricket chirped once, then decided that was enough. Somewhere far away, a cow shifted in its sleep. The sound traveled so gently, it might have been part of a dream. Courage stepped into the field. Each blade of grass bent under his weight, then lifted again, not even whispering about his passing. He took the long path toward the water trough. The moon lay across it, like a sheet of glass, unbroken by ripples. It looked like you could step straight into it, and fall into another sky. He lowered his head. His reflection blinked back at him. The ears were his. The eyes were his. But the way the moonlight softened them made him look braver than he felt. Courage sat beside the trough, and let the night settle around him. It felt almost alive, like the quiet was choosing to be here, not just happening by accident. And in that stillness, he realized something. The wind wasn't missing. It was listening, The fields, the fence, the trough, the sky, all leaning in, as if the earth itself had asked for silence, just so it could hear the softest thing. Courage didn't know what that softest thing was, but he stayed, because whatever it was, it deserved not to be missed. The night seemed to draw itself a little closer to Courage, like a blanket being pulled in around his shoulders. The trough sat beside him, its water holding the moon without spilling a drop. The fence, the grass, the barn in the distance, all of them part of the same still picture. Courage's ears twitched, but not because of fear. It was instinct, the old habit of listening for trouble. Yet tonight, even trouble seemed to have stayed home. He looked toward the windmill. It hadn't moved since he last saw it. Its blades were pointed just slightly off-center, as though it had been caught mid-breath. Usually, the windmill's voice was constant, groaning, creaking, chattering with the breeze. It was the old storyteller of the yard, always in conversation with the sky. But tonight, it was keeping its stories to itself. Courage stepped away from the trough, walking slowly toward the open space where the field widened. Every step felt like he was being watched, not in the way that made his fur rise, but in the way that made him feel safe. It was a strange thing, to be guarded by something he couldn't see. Usually, when the world went quiet, it meant danger was waiting. But tonight, the quiet itself felt like the guard. He paused halfway across the field. The air didn't stir, not even the faint brush of temperature changing between here and there. It was all one smooth, gentle thing, like stepping into water that matched your own warmth exactly. The stars above him seemed clearer. They weren't blinking through moving air anymore. They shone steady, like the sky had frozen just to hold them still for him. Somewhere far off, he thought he saw a shadow shift against the horizon, too slow to be a threat, too far to be fear. The quiet didn't break. If anything, it deepened. Courage sat in the middle of the field, tail curling against his side, and simply breathed. He imagined the quiet was wrapping around the farmhouse, protecting Muriel, softening Eustace's grumbles into harmless mutters. The kind of night where even the smallest sound, a sigh, a paw step, a whisper, would feel like it mattered. And so he chose not to make one at all. Courage stayed in the middle of the field, his paws tucked neatly under him, as if he were part of the ground now, rooted in its calm. The air around him felt thick, but not heavy, more like it was holding something delicate, something that might break if the wind returned too soon. He tilted his head. It almost felt expectant, like the quiet had called him here on purpose. Above him, the stars seemed to lean in. They didn't shimmer or flicker. They watched. They waited. Courage let his eyes close for a moment. In the darkness behind them, he thought he could hear a hum. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling, like the low thrum of a heartbeat far away. It was slow, steady, and it matched the rhythm of his own chest. The two beats merged until he couldn't tell which was his, and which belonged to the earth. He opened his eyes again. The field looked the same, but it felt different, as if it had told him something without speaking. A wordless promise that no harm would come tonight. The fence in the distance stood straighter than usual, as if it too had been given purpose. The barn's shadow looked softer. Even the trees at the far end of the property seemed to have settled in, their branches resting instead of reaching. He realized then that the quiet wasn't just around him. It was with him. It followed the slow turn of his head, waited for him to choose each breath, not leading, not trailing, just walking beside him in the way a true friend would. He stood and began to walk back toward the farmhouse. The stillness moved with him, keeping pace, wrapping each paw step in its gentle weight. When he reached the porch, he stopped. He didn't go inside. He sat at the top step, looking out at the yard, as if it were a painting he'd never noticed hanging there before. In the quiet, he could almost believe the night was speaking to him, not in words, not in sound, but in the kind of understanding that doesn't need either. Courage stayed on the porch step, his paws pressed into the cool wood, his eyes tracing the outline of the still fields. The quiet had been with him so long now, that he almost forgot the world was ever anything else. It felt natural, like this was how nights were always meant to be. But as he sat there, he noticed something new, a shift so small it was almost invisible. Far out past the barn, a blade of grass trembled. Not much, just enough to catch the moonlight differently for a moment. Another tremble came from the far fence, and another from the corner of the shed roof. The wind hadn't returned yet. Not fully, but the stillness was loosening its hold. Courage thought about standing, but something told him to stay exactly where he was. The quiet wasn't gone yet. It had one more thing to do. He closed his eyes, listening not for sounds, but for what the night had been trying to say all along. And then he felt it, not in his ears, but in his chest, a calm so steady, so sure that he knew it wasn't his alone. It was something the quiet was leaving behind, like a gift he could carry when the wind came back. It was a reminder that silence didn't have to mean emptiness. It could mean safety. It could mean trust. It could mean the world was holding its breath, just to make room for you. He opened his eyes. The fields were still still. The windmill still rested. But he knew the moment was close to changing. And when it did, he would be ready. Because now he carried the quiet with him, like a lantern lit from the inside. Courage kept his eyes on the yard, knowing the stillness couldn't last forever. But that didn't make him sad. The gift it had left inside him was somewhere, far off, a leaf shifted. Then another. The faintest ripple touched the trough's surface, breaking the moon into 1,000 tiny silver coins. The first thread of wind slid through the fence, slow and cautious, as if asking permission to return. It brushed Courage's fur gently, testing the weight of the night before it settled in again. The fields bent slightly, their long stillness giving way to a slow swaying dance. The sagebrush whispered as it moved. The windmill gave one soft creak, a sound like a yawn after a long, deep rest. Courage closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the change. The quiet wasn't gone. It had just stepped aside to make room for motion again. And now both could exist together. He rose and padded to the door, the boards giving a small familiar groan under his weight. Inside the house was dim and warm. Muriel had shifted in her chair, the blanket slipping from her shoulder. Courage trotted over and nudged it back into place, then curled himself on the rug at her feet. Through the open window the wind hummed low in the grass. It was no longer silent, but it wasn't rushing or loud. It was gentle, like a friend telling you they're back, and they're not in a hurry to leave again. Courage's eyes grew heavy. The weight of the night, the stillness, the return of the breeze, all of it rocked him toward sleep. Just before he drifted off, a thought settled in his mind. The quiet might not visit often, but when it does, it leaves something behind. And even when the wind is moving, that stillness will always be there, tucked away inside him. The windmill creaked one last time, steady and calm, and Courage let the sound carry him into dreams. It began the way so many nights in nowhere did, with a sound. Courage didn't understand. It came from far off, low and steady, rolling through the fields like a wagon wheel on soft dirt. Not fast, not frantic, just approaching. Usually, that was enough to make him scurry. He'd run for Muriel, or hide behind her chair, or search for something to push against the door. But tonight, he didn't move. He stood at the edge of the porch, paws pressed into the old wood, eyes fixed on the horizon. The night air moved gently past him, bringing with it the faint smell of dust and dry grass. The sound grew closer, but not louder, like it was gliding instead of walking. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't chasing. It was simply coming. The windmill turned once in the distance, its groan folding into the night's silence. Even the crickets seemed to pause, their music thinning into soft, scattered notes. Courage's ears twitched, but he didn't turn his head. Every part of him wanted to fidget, to pace, to look behind him, to hide. But he stayed exactly where he was. He didn't know why. It wasn't courage the way people thought of it. It was something quieter, something that came from the stillness deep inside him. And in that stillness, he felt the world pause with him. The air seemed to thicken, not with fear, but with attention, as if everything in the yard, every board of the house, every blade of grass, was waiting to see what he would do next. So, he did nothing. The sound in the distance shifted, not louder, not faster, just aware. Courage could feel it noticing him. The way you can feel eyes on you even if you can't see them. It wasn't a sharp stare. It was slower, measured, curious. He stayed on the porch, his paws still rooted to the boards, his gaze steady. Out in the dark, the shapes of the fields bent slightly, as though the grass itself leaned forward to see more clearly. The fence posts, lined up like quiet sentinels, seemed taller somehow. The air between Courage and the thing in the distance was a stretch of nothing. No sound, no motion, only the long thread of attention connecting them. A moth floated past him, its wings whispering in the still air. It landed on the porch rail, facing the same direction as him. Even the smallest creatures, it seemed, were waiting. Normally, his tail would be tucked, his shoulders hunched, his breath quick and shallow. But now his tail hung loose, his back was straight, and his breathing moved in slow, steady waves. The presence out there in the dark shifted again. Not closer, not farther, just turning, like someone tilting their head to study a picture. Courage didn't flinch, not because he wasn't scared, but because moving felt wrong, as if the stillness itself was the thing holding the night together. For a long while, neither of them moved, and then the strangest thought came to him, that maybe the thing in the distance wasn't deciding what to do next. It was waiting for him to. The night stretched, so much that time itself began to feel different. Seconds didn't pass one by one anymore. They floated, spreading out like ripples in still water. Courage's eyes stayed fixed ahead. He didn't blink often, but when he did, it was slow, like the blink was part of the stillness, not a break from it. Out in the dark, the presence began to soften. It was subtle, the way its weight on the air eased, the way its shape seemed less certain, like it was unlearning whatever reason it had for coming. Courage could feel it changing, not because of anything he did, but because of what he didn't do. The windmill stood behind him, silent and still, its tall frame holding its breath alongside him. The boards of the porch stayed quiet. The grass held steady, refusing even the smallest sway. It was as if the whole yard had decided to match his stillness. The presence shifted again, and this time it felt smaller, not weaker, just less certain of its own size. A star slid free from a thin wisp of cloud, casting a faint silver light on the field. In that pale glow, Courage thought he saw the outline of something tall draw in on itself slightly, as if folding in its edges. Neither of them moved closer, neither stepped back, but the space between them was no longer the same space. It was warmer now, less like a line dividing them, and more like a path, one that didn't need to be walked. And so they stayed, sharing the kind of silence that doesn't press for answers, doesn't demand a choice, just let you be. Courage stayed exactly where he was, his paws planted in the same worn spots on the porch boards. He didn't shift his weight, he didn't turn his head. He was as much a part of the night now as the fence posts and the windmill. Something strange began to happen. The stillness that had started as his own now seemed to stretch outward, wrapping itself around the thing in the distance. It was a quiet without threat, not trapping, not holding hostage, just protecting. He realized then that he wasn't only keeping himself calm, he was keeping the other presence calm too. His stillness was saying, without words, you don't have to decide anything right now. The thought surprised him. Usually, danger came fast and sharp, and his choices were all about running, or fighting or hiding. But here, the choice was to do nothing, and that nothing was becoming enough. A faint glow from the farmhouse window brushed against the yard, catching the edge of the fence, making it look like it was standing watch alongside him. The air between them felt warmer now, like the tension had loosened. Whatever had come toward him earlier wasn't pressing forward anymore. It simply stayed, quiet, breathing, matching his pace, the way a shadow matches the body it belongs to. The night didn't feel like a standoff anymore. It felt like a truce, and so Courage remained there, a small figure in the wide dark, holding the space steady for both of them. The air shifted first, not sharply, not in warning, just a slow loosening, like the night had been holding its breath, and was finally ready to let it go. Courage stayed exactly as he was. His paws felt the familiar grain of the porch boards beneath them. His chest rose and fell in the same unhurried rhythm. Out in the dark, the presence began to drift back, not turning away sharply, not vanishing, but easing itself out of the space they had been sharing. It was a retreat without fear, more like a guest, quietly leaving a room so as not to disturb the person still sitting inside. Courage didn't chase it. He didn't even follow it with his eyes. He kept his gaze on the same point in the field, letting the distance between them fill itself slowly. The windmill gave a single low groan, as if acknowledging the change. The grass at the far edge of the yard moved just slightly, as though it was stretching after being still for too long. And yet the peace remained. Whatever had come here tonight had not been chased away. It had simply decided not to come closer. Perhaps, Courage thought, it had gotten whatever it needed just by being near him. Perhaps the stillness had been enough for both of them. The stars above blinked again, this time in a softer, more familiar way. The night began to feel less like a held breath, and more like a slow, steady exhale. But Courage stayed in place, because even if the moment was ending, he wasn't going to be the one to end it. The last trace of the presence faded into the dark, its absence leaving behind a space that felt neither empty nor lonely. The night had settled again, but not in the same way as before. This time it was softer, less like a sky overhead, and more like a blanket around the farmhouse. Courage remained still for a while longer. He didn't rush to go inside. He didn't break the spell too soon. Somewhere far off, a breeze stirred, rolling slowly across the fields. It carried no urgency, just the scent of grass and the faint memory of warm earth. The windmill answered with a single low creak, as if saying, "It's all right now." Only then did Courage shift his weight. His paws lifted from the porch boards, and the wood gave a tiny sigh beneath him. He turned toward the door. Inside, Muriel's chair rocked gently, its motion so small he couldn't tell if it was from her shifting in her sleep, or if the house itself had decided to keep her company. Courage padded across the room, curled himself on the rug at her feet, and closed his eyes. He thought about how he hadn't run, hadn't hidden, hadn't panicked, and how, somehow, that had been enough. It didn't make him feel bigger. It didn't make him feel braver. It simply made him feel right. And as sleep began to take him, he realized that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to stand still long enough for the world to change its mind. The wind picked up again outside, moving through the fields like a slow song. The night exhaled, and Courage let go with it. The day had been quiet in nowhere, too quiet. Even for nowhere, the wind moved lazily across the fields, brushing the grass in long, gentle waves. The sun was low, its light spilling thick and golden over the dirt road that cut through the middle of the open land. Courage sat on the porch steps, watching the horizon the way Muriel sometimes did when she was waiting for Eustace to come back from town. Only tonight there was no one to wait for, and yet something was moving out there. At first it was no more than a smudge, a faint shadow against the sunlit dust, but slowly it began to take shape. A tall figure walking the road, carrying nothing but their own shadow. They didn't hurry. They didn't wander. They walked as if they knew exactly where each footstep belonged. Courage tilted his head. He didn't feel the usual pinch of fear that came when strangers appeared in nowhere. This felt different, quieter, like the air had made room for them. The traveler came closer, close enough that Courage could see the soft sway of their coat and the way the light pooled around their boots. Close enough that each step sounded like it had been set there hours ago, and the rest of the world was just catching up. They didn't glance toward the farmhouse right away. Their gaze stayed steady on the road ahead. But when they reached the fence line, they slowed, and for the first time their eyes found him. The traveler paused at the fence, resting one hand lightly on the smooth top rail. For a moment, they simply looked at Courage, their face calm in a way that didn't demand anything from him. The late sunlight caught in their eyes, turning them into small mirrors of the sky. It was the kind of look that seemed to see more than what was in front of it, as if they were looking at Courage now, and also at something he couldn't remember about himself. Without speaking, they lifted the latch and stepped inside the yard. The gate clicked shut behind them, not with the sound of keeping something out, but with the sound of closing a book gently. Their boots moved over the dry ground, without kicking up much dust. Each step was measured, not slow, not fast, just certain. Courage stayed on the porch. He didn't bark. He didn't move back. There was no reason to. The traveler's coat brushed softly against their legs as they walked, carrying the faint smell of faraway places. Roads Courage had never seen. Fields that grew different kinds of grass. Skies that told other stories at night. They stopped at the foot of the steps. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them felt settled, like two chairs that had been set in the same room for years without anyone noticing until now. The wind shifted just enough to bring the scent of Muriel's baking out through the open window. The traveler smiled faintly, and Courage, without knowing why, felt the smallest wave of safety roll through him. The traveler placed one foot on the first porch step, but didn't climb any higher. They stayed there, their height enough to meet Courage's gaze without leaning down. For a moment, they just looked at him. Really looked. Not past him. Not through him. But at him. Then in a voice as steady as the road behind them, they spoke. "You're braver than you think." That was all. No long explanation. No story of how they knew. Just those 6 words, as if they had been carrying them for a long time, and had finally found the one they were meant for. The sound of the words didn't rush away into the air like most sounds did in nowhere. It lingered, settling in the space between them, then sinking deeper, like rainwater soaking into dry soil. Courage didn't move. He didn't tilt his head. He only let the words find a place to sit inside him, somewhere they wouldn't be knocked loose no matter how many storms came later. The traveler smiled. Not wide, not quick, but in a way that made the smile feel like it had always been there. And still, they didn't step closer. The traveler lifted one hand slowly. No rush in the movement, no suddenness to startle him. Courage didn't flinch. Something in the stillness told him there was no reason to. The hand rested gently on his head, warm through his fur, steady as if it belonged there. It wasn't the quick, distracted pat of someone passing by. It was unhurried, thoughtful, a pat that seemed to say, "I see you. I know what it costs to be you, and I'm glad you're here anyway." For a moment, Courage closed his eyes. The weight of the hand wasn't heavy, but it anchored him in place like nothing could move him until it lifted. When the traveler finally drew their hand away, the warmth stayed. It sank into him, the way sunlight does after a long, cold day. No words followed. None were needed. The message had already been given. The traveler's gaze lingered a second longer, as though making sure the words and the touch had truly reached him. And then, they stepped back down from the porch. The traveler turned toward the gate, their coat shifting softly with the motion. They didn't rush. Each step was as measured as when they arrived. But now there was a quiet finality in them, the kind that says a moment has been completed. Courage stayed on the porch. He didn't follow, didn't call out, didn't even take a step forward. Something told him this was one of those meetings that was meant to end exactly where it did. The latch of the gate clicked open. The traveler stepped through, closing it gently behind them, as though even the smallest sound should be treated with care tonight. The dirt road welcomed them back, its pale dust curling faintly around their boots before settling again. The fields on either side swayed a little in the breeze, as if bowing them along their way. Courage watched until their figure grew smaller, the line of their shoulders and the slow swing of their steps melting into the horizon's golden haze. He could no longer see their face, but the words remained in the air, wrapped around him like a scarf he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The road kept stretching ahead for them. The porch stayed still beneath him, and the space between grew longer. But it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like something that had been added, and would never be taken away. The road was empty now. Only the fading light remained, spilling across the fields in soft, uneven patches. Courage stayed on the porch a little longer, listening to the breeze drift through the fence posts, watching the dust settle on the road where the traveler's footsteps had been. He thought about following, just to see where they might be headed. But the thought passed quickly. This meeting wasn't meant to be chased. It was meant to be kept. When he finally turned toward the door, the hinges gave their usual soft groan. Inside, the air was warm and familiar, carrying the faint scent of Muriel's cooking and the quiet creak of her rocking chair. She glanced up when he patted in. "There you are, dear," she said with a smile, as if he had only been out for a moment. Courage settled onto the rug at her feet, curling himself into the space where the lamplight pooled. The words echoed again in his mind. Not loud, not insistent, but steady. "You're braver than you think." He didn't try to puzzle out why they had been said, or what the traveler might have seen in him. He just let them stay. They felt like they belonged now, woven into the quiet of the house, woven into him. Outside, the road stretched on without them, and somewhere, the traveler walked beneath a different sky. But here, in this warm, still room, Courage closed his eyes, knowing that those words would walk with him for the rest of his days. Courage woke to the sound of nothing unusual. No clatter from the yard. No strange thud in the attic. No eerie whisper in the hallway. Just the soft stretch of morning, folding itself gently over the farmhouse. The light came in slow through the curtains, touching the floor before it touched him. It was warm, the kind of light that doesn't rush you out of bed but invites you to stay a little longer. He lifted his head and listened. The floorboards in the kitchen creaked in their familiar way. Not the sharp protest of someone rushing, but the old steady sighs of wood that had learned to live with time. There was the faint clink of a teacup, the whistle of a kettle, soft, not shrill, like it was more suggestion than command. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Muriel hummed to herself, not to chase away fear, not to fill a silence, just because she was happy enough to. Courage blinked. He searched for the wrongness, the hidden corner where the day might be waiting to startle him. But there was nothing there. It was simply a morning, a whole morning where nothing was broken, missing, or scary. Courage padded across the floor, his paws landing in the same spots they always had. Spots worn smooth by years of mornings, just like this. The kitchen light spilled across the table, turning the wood golden. Dust motes floated in the beam, moving lazily, as if they too had nothing urgent to do. Muriel stood by the counter, her back to him, pouring tea into her favorite cup. Steam curled upward in soft white ribbons. The kettle sat quietly now, its job done, its little puff of warmth still in the air. On the stove, a small pan held something simple, oatmeal, slowly thickening in the low heat. The kind of breakfast that didn't need watching, because it knew how to wait. Muriel glanced over her shoulder. Her smile wasn't surprised, wasn't meant to reassure him. It was the everyday kind, the smile she might give to the sun just for rising again. "Morning, dear," she said, her voice as calm as the tea she was stirring. Courage's ears twitched, catching the gentle creak of the rocking chair in the next room, the faint tick of the clock above the door, the distant hum of the windmill outside. Nothing sharp, nothing strange. Every sound was a sound he trusted. He sat by the table, letting the warmth from the window and the warmth from Muriel's voice blend together in his chest. Courage sat quietly, letting his eyes wander over the room. The teapot on the counter wore the same tiny chip it had worn for years, but it hadn't grown any larger. It was just a part of it now, a small imperfection that made it feel more like home. Muriel's apron was tied a little crooked in the back. One slipper was slightly more worn than the other. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few strands catching the sunlight. The oatmeal on the stove gave a soft, patient bubble, not hurrying, not demanding attention. From outside came the faint sound of the windmill turning, steady and untroubled, its creak as familiar as a lullaby. No windows rattled, no shadows shifted in places they shouldn't be. The only movement in the room was the gentle stir of Muriel's spoon in her cup, and the lazy swirl of steam above it. Courage's shoulders eased. He hadn't even realized they'd been tight. It was strange, how quiet safety could be, and how rare. He didn't need to guard Muriel this morning. He didn't need to look over his shoulder. He could just be here, and that was enough. Muriel carried her tea to the table, and sat across from him. Her chair gave a little sigh, as she settled in. "You're up early," she said. Her eyes are kind but curious. Courage only blinked at her. How could he explain that the morning itself had woken him, just so he wouldn't miss it? Muriel sipped her tea, her eyes soft and unfocused, as though she were looking out at something far away, but in no rush to get there. Courage stayed where he was, watching the steam rise from her cup. It curled and swirled in the sunlight, then vanished as if the air had taken it gently away. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was comfortable. Not an empty space to be filled, but a warm place to rest in. Somewhere down the hall, Eustace's snoring rolled in and out, steady as the turning of the windmill outside. Even his grumbles in sleep sounded harmless today. Muriel's spoon tapped lightly against her cup. A bird outside the window gave one short, contented chirp, then settled into the morning just like they had. The sun reached a little farther across the table, touching Courage's paws with its warmth. He stretched one leg, then another, slow and deliberate, as though matching the pace of the day. Muriel glanced at him and smiled again. That same simple, everyday smile. It wasn't a reassurance after fear, or a reward for something he'd done. It was just love, quiet and constant, the way the light loves the floorboards each morning. Courage breathed in, and the air smelled of tea, warm oats, and the faintest hint of the lavender soap Muriel had used the night before. He thought, if the day never changed from this moment, it would be enough. Courage stayed at the table, eyes drifting slowly from one familiar thing to another. The pattern in the table's wood, the way the curtain by the window shifted just slightly when the breeze slipped in, the chipped edge of Muriel's favorite mug, turned just so in her hand. Every piece of the morning felt like it had been placed carefully, like a photograph that had taken years to arrange itself. He knew mornings like this didn't come often. Not here. Not in nowhere. Usually there was a creak that didn't belong, or a shadow where shadows shouldn't be, or a knock at the door from someone who wasn't really someone. But today, nothing waited, nothing chased, nothing demanded. It was just them, Muriel with her tea, Eustace asleep down the hall, and Courage in the golden light with nowhere else to be. He wished he could fold the morning up, like Muriel folded her quilts in the spring, and tuck it away somewhere safe. Somewhere he could take it out on the days when the wind screamed through the windows and the floor shook under his paws. Muriel refilled her tea, the gentle pour breaking the silence only to make it feel warmer when it returned. Courage decided, right then, that he would remember everything. The light, the smells, the sound of the floor under Muriel's slippers, and the way her smile felt like it had always been waiting for him. The sun shifted higher, pulling the light across the floor in slow, patient inches. The air grew a little warmer, and the tea in Muriel's cup dropped to its last sip. Somewhere down the hall, Eustace's footsteps finally stirred. They were slow, dragging along the floorboards in their usual uneven rhythm. Even that sound, so often the start of a grumble, felt gentle today. Muriel rose from the table, her chair giving its soft sigh as she left it. She moved toward the sink, placing her cup down with the same care she gave to planting seeds in the garden. Courage followed her into the living room. The sunlight had reached the rug now, and he curled himself in the warmest patch, resting his chin on his paws. Through the open window, the windmill turned slowly. No rush, no strain. Its creak sounded more like a lullaby than a warning. Courage closed his eyes, but not to sleep. He wanted to feel the day in every way he could. The weight of the air, the hum of the house, the steady presence of Muriel nearby. He knew the quiet wouldn't last forever, But that was all right, because he had found a way to keep it. Not in his paws, not in his teeth, but in the place inside him where safe things are stored. And as the clock in the hall marked the slow climb toward noon, he let the morning settle in his memory, unchanged, untouched, exactly as it had been. A rare morning when nothing was wrong, and everything was right enough to last a lifetime. It was late afternoon and nowhere. The kind of day when the sun feels heavy, and the shadows stretch themselves long across the ground. Courage sat on the porch steps, his chin resting on the top one, watching the far field. The Scarecrow stood in its usual place, straw hat tilted forward, patchwork shirt hanging loose in the still air. It had been there for as long as Courage could remember, its face drawn on in a faded, crooked smile. Most days, he didn't give it more than a glance. It was part of the scenery, like the fence or the windmill. But today, something was different. The air was still, not a hint of breeze. The grass lay flat and quiet, and even the crows kept their distance. Courage's eyes lingered on the Scarecrow for no particular reason. And that's when it happened. One of its straw-stuffed arms lifted slowly, deliberately, until the hand was raised in the air. It didn't jerk like the wind was pushing it. It didn't sway on its post. It moved in one smooth motion, a slow, gentle wave. Courage blinked. Once, twice. The Scarecrow's arm lowered again, settling back into its place, as if nothing at all had happened. But Courage knew what he'd seen. Courage kept his eyes on the Scarecrow. It didn't move again. Its arm hung loose, shirt sleeve resting without a ripple. He glanced at the grass around it. Still no wind. Not even the faint rustle of a stalk shifting. Part of him wanted to walk straight into the field, to stand right at its post, and see if it would do it again. But another part, the part that knew some moments change, if you get too close too soon, told him to wait. He stayed on the porch steps, ears pricked forward, tail curled close to his side. The field stretched between them, gold in the sunlight, the stalks swaying only when a grasshopper moved between them. Nothing else stirred. The Scarecrow's head was still tilted, its stitched smile unchanged, its button eyes fixed in the same far-off gaze. And yet, Courage couldn't shake the feeling that it knew exactly where he was sitting. He thought about calling Muriel, but her soft hum from the kitchen made him stop. This was his moment. Calling someone else into it felt like it might scare the moment away. So he stayed, watching, waiting, breathing with the rhythm of the still field. If it waved again, he wanted to be ready, and this time, he'd be sure it was meant for him. Courage rose from the porch step, shaking off the warmth the wood had left in his fur. The grass between him and the Scarecrow looked longer than it had a minute ago, as if the field had quietly stretched itself while he was sitting still. He placed one paw on the dirt path that cut through the fence line. It didn't crunch. The earth was soft, and it accepted his weight without a sound. Step by step, he moved into the field. The air was warm, but there was a coolness in the shade of each tall stalk, like the field was hiding its own pockets of rest. The Scarecrow stayed where it was, motionless, its hat casting a shadow across its painted face. But even without moving, it felt as though its gaze followed him. Courage's paws brushed against the lower leaves of the plants, each one dry enough to whisper as he passed. The sound was faint, too small to disturb the stillness. Halfway to the Scarecrow, he paused. It loomed taller now, its figure outlined against the pale sky. He couldn't tell if it looked the same as before, or if something in its posture had shifted. Shoulders not quite where they were, hat brim turned just a little too far. The field around them was quiet. No birds overhead, no insects buzzing close. Even the far-off windmill was silent. And then, standing there in the middle of the field, Courage had the strange thought that maybe he wasn't walking to the Scarecrow at all. Maybe he was walking into its waiting. Courage took the last few steps, his paws sinking slightly into the soft earth at the base of the post. The Scarecrow towered over him, its straw hands hanging at its sides. Patchwork shirt faded in the sunlight. Up close, he could see the stitches in its smile, loops of black thread pulling the fabric into that crooked grin. One of its button eyes was cracked, but the other caught the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. Courage tilted his head, waiting. He didn't move closer than a paw's length from the post. Whatever had happened before, he didn't want to startle it away. The Scarecrow didn't shift. Not yet. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Steady but not fast. The field around them was still holding its breath, as though every stalk was watching. And then, its arm moved, slow without the jerk of wind or the sag of loose rope. The straw-stuffed limb lifted from its side. The hand rose until it was level with Courage's head. Fingers of hay splaying slightly in the air. A wave, not frantic, not mechanical, but gentle, like a neighbor greeting you across a quiet fence. Courage didn't step back. He didn't bark. He only stood there, ears forward, watching the straw fingers shift ever so slightly before lowering again. The arm returned to its place, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Courage stood for a while longer, his paws planted in the warm dirt, looking up at the Scarecrow. It didn't move again. Its hat brim shaded the painted grin. Its arms hung still, and yet, it didn't feel like the moment was over. Very slowly, Courage turned away. The field's path opened in front of him, sunlight spilling between the tall rows of stalks. He took a step, then another. The whisper of dry leaves brushed against his sides as he made his way back toward the farmhouse. But even as he walked, he could feel it, the quiet weight of the Scarecrow's attention, as if it was still watching him go. Not in a heavy, frightening way, more like the way Muriel would watch him when he was walking ahead of her on the road, making sure he didn't stray too far. At the edge of the field, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. The Scarecrow stood exactly as before, rooted in its post, shirt hanging loose, face fixed in its stitched smile. But from here, in the hazy light of the late day, it almost looked like its head had turned just slightly toward him. Courage blinked. The stillness held. He stepped through the gate, the latch clicking softly behind him. But the sense of being accompanied didn't fade until he reached the porch. Courage climbed the porch steps slowly, his paws pressing into the same warm spots where he'd been sitting earlier. The farmhouse door stood open, letting out the smell of Muriel's cooking, and the soft creak of her chair in the kitchen. He could hear her humming faintly, the tune drifting out into the yard like a thread of light. But his eyes didn't leave the field. Not yet. From here the Scarecrow was small again, just another shape among the tall stalks, its arms hanging loose, its hat bowed against the sun. And still, he watched it, because a part of him thought that maybe, just maybe, if he was patient enough, it might lift its arm again. The minutes passed. The windmill turned once in the distance, its groan low and easy. A pair of crows flew overhead, but none dared land near the Scarecrow. Courage rested his chin on the top porch step. The warmth of the wood seeped into his fur. The steady sounds of the house settled behind him. Whether the wave had been real, or only something the day had shaped for him alone, it didn't matter. The feeling it left behind, that small, surprising connection, was real enough to keep. Eventually, he stood and went inside. But the last thing he saw before the door closed was the Scarecrow in its place, rooted to the field, silent and still, as if holding the rest of its story for another day. It was a quiet night in nowhere, the kind where the wind didn't push at the windows and the floorboards kept their sighs to themselves. Courage was curled on his bed at the foot of Muriel's chair, the glow from the lamp fading into a gentle amber. Muriel's knitting needles had gone still in her lap, and her breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Eustace's snores rumbled faintly from the other room, not too loud tonight, more like the low hum of distant machinery that you almost stopped noticing. Courage's eyes grew heavy. The warmth of the room, the steady sound of the clock, and the comfort of knowing Muriel was right there pulled him toward sleep like a tide. At first, he dreamed of nothing at all, just soft colors, and the weightless feeling of drifting somewhere safe. And then, shapes began to form. A doorway, a street he knew but couldn't have remembered, and the smell of warm bread, floating through the air as if someone had just taken it from the oven. His paws touched familiar ground, the kind of ground that feels like it remembers you. He looked up, and there they were, his parents, exactly as they had been, safe, whole, smiling at him like no time had passed at all. The air was soft here, as if every breeze had been warmed before it reached the ground. Courage walked between his parents. Their steps slow, matching his without effort. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The streets were just as he somehow remembered them, cobbled stones smooth under his paws, edges worn down by years of gentle footsteps. Every doorway they passed seemed to lean toward them in greeting. Windows glowed with the light of early evening. Shadows stretched across the road, but none of them felt unfriendly. A cat slept on a windowsill, its tail flicking lazily, as though it had been keeping watch and could finally rest. Now that Courage was home, somewhere, a bell chimed once, not to signal the hour, but simply to be part of the air. The smell of warm bread followed them, sometimes stronger, sometimes fading, but never gone. It carried with it the memory of mornings when the world was nothing but safe routines and gentle voices. They passed a small shop with baskets of apples stacked neatly outside. The shopkeeper looked up, smiled at Courage, and gave a small nod to his parents, as if to say, "It's good to see you all together again." Courage's chest felt full, like it couldn't hold any more of this without spilling over. But the feeling wasn't heavy. It was light, the way a blanket feels when it's exactly the right weight on a cool night. And still his parents walked with him, turning down a road that led deeper into the glow of home. The road ended at a small gate, its hinges giving a soft, friendly creak as his father pushed it open. Beyond it stood the house, their house, exactly as it had been. The roof sloped low and welcoming. The windows glowed with evening light, and the air carried that same smell of bread, now stronger, as if the kitchen door had just been opened. His mother stepped forward first, holding the door wide. Courage padded inside, his paws finding the grooves in the wood floor like they'd never forgotten them. The walls were warm in color, lined with shelves that held the same things he'd seen long ago. A blue vase with a single dried flower, a row of jars filled with herbs, the clock that ticked in a voice as steady as a heartbeat. In the corner, a basket lay just where it used to, lined with a folded blanket he remembered curling into as a pup. It still smelled faintly of sunshine and the grass from their old garden. From the kitchen came the quiet clink of plates, and then his father's voice, low, warm, saying something to his mother that Courage couldn't quite catch. But he knew the tone. It was the sound of a day ending peacefully, with everyone home and safe. His mother glanced at him and smiled, the same smile she'd given him 1,000 times, the one that made everything else fade away. She set a small plate on the floor for him, a piece of fresh bread, still warm enough that the butter melted into it. He took a bite. The taste was exactly as he remembered. Soft, simple, perfect. And in that bite, the whole house seemed to breathe around him. After the bread, Courage curled into his old basket. The blanket there wasn't just soft. It was familiar. The kind of softness that comes from years of being held close. From his spot on the floor, he could see his parents moving about the kitchen. His father stirred something in a pot, pausing now and then to taste it. His mother hummed a tune that had no hurry in it at all. The sound of their voices was low, like a fire crackling on the hearth. Not every word reached him, but the tone told the whole story. Everything was fine. There was no rush, no worry, no reason to listen for danger. A small draft came through the open window, bringing with it the cool scent of the evening air, grass, a little earth, and the faint sweetness of flowers blooming nearby. The old clock in the corner ticked steadily, its pendulum swinging like it had all the time in the world. Courage's eyes grew heavy again, but not from exhaustion, from comfort, the kind that seeps in slowly, wrapping around you, until you forget there's anything outside of it. He realized this wasn't just a dream he was seeing, it was one he was feeling. The floor beneath him had weight, the bread had taste, the air had warmth. It was as if the dream had been built from the pieces of his real memories, stitched together so perfectly that nothing felt missing. And in that moment, he didn't think about waking up at all. Courage lifted his head from the blanket, not because he was restless, but because something inside him wanted to see it all again. Before the night grew thin, he padded out of the kitchen and into the narrow hallway. The walls held framed photographs. Some he remembered, others that felt like they belonged here, even if he'd never seen them before. Smiling faces, warm places, moments caught in amber light. He passed the living room, The couch sagged just a little in the middle, in that familiar way that made it the best spot to curl up. A book lay open on the armrest, its pages fluttering slightly, as if it too was breathing. Through the back door he could see the small garden, the one where he'd first chased a butterfly, and his mother had laughed, clapping her hands like he'd done something wonderful. The flowers swayed lightly, though the air was still. He moved into the front room, where the evening light pooled on the rug. It was the kind of light that made colors softer, as if it wanted the day to close in peace. His parents were there now, waiting by the door. They didn't call to him. They only watched him with patient smiles, as though they knew this was his time to take it all in. Courage felt the pull, that quiet tug that comes before a dream ends. But it didn't frighten him. He knew some part of this would follow him back. The light in the house dimmed, the way it does just before a dream lets go. His parents were still by the door, their smiles soft, their eyes steady. Courage stepped toward them, feeling the floorboards under his paws, hearing the faint creak he knew so well. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to. Instead, his mother reached down and placed a warm paw on his head, just as she had when he was small. The smell of bread filled the air again, so warm it felt like sunlight pressing against his fur. And then he opened his eyes. The room in nowhere was dim, the early morning light just brushing the curtains. Muriel was still asleep in her chair, her knitting in her lap. Eustace's snores rolled in from the other room. For a moment he stayed still, not wanting to break the link between here and there. The warmth in his chest hadn't faded. The smell of bread lingered, faint but real enough that he almost thought Muriel must have been baking. He stretched, slow and careful, and settled back down at Muriel's feet. The house felt safe this morning, quiet in a way that matched the dream. All through the day, whether he was in the yard, at the porch, or curled in his spot, that feeling stayed. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was something he carried, a piece of home, tucked where nothing in nowhere could take it away. The night in nowhere was the kind where the wind scraped softly at the side of the house, but didn't have the energy to howl. Muriel was in the kitchen, the hum of her voice drifting in and out as she worked on something warm for later. Eustace sat in his old armchair, the springs giving their familiar groan as he settled in. The glow from the TV flickered over the room, colors shifting on the worn wallpaper. Courage lay on the floor nearby, head on his paws, half watching the light, half listening to the sounds of the house. It was an ordinary evening, the kind where nothing seemed about to happen, which in nowhere was rare enough to feel suspicious. Eustace shifted in his chair. Normally that meant he was getting ready to shoo Courage away or grumble about something. But instead he slid slightly to the side. Not much, just enough that one worn cushion on the armchair was left open. He didn't look at Courage. He didn't say a word, but the space was there, and it was enough to feel like an invitation. Courage lifted his head from his paws, ears tilting toward the chair. The space Eustace had made was small, just enough for him if he curled tight. It wasn't the kind of thing Eustace usually offered. Courage stayed where he was at first, watching out of the corner of his eye. Eustace kept his gaze on the TV, jaw set in that way that made it hard to tell if he was thinking about something or nothing at all. The wind outside brushed against the window. The clock in the hall gave a soft tick. The house waited. Courage shifted his paws under him, then stopped. If this was a trick, the kind that ended with Eustace shouting or waving him off, it would sting more than usual tonight. He looked again at the empty space. It didn't seem like much, but it was there, and Eustace hadn't moved to take it back. Muriel's humming reached them from the kitchen, low and steady. It wrapped around the room like a blanket that made it easier to take a risk. Courage stood, paws making no sound on the floor, and took one small step toward the chair. Courage reached the side of the armchair and paused, looking up at Eustace. Eustace didn't glance down. He kept his eyes on the TV, his face as still as ever. But he hadn't moved away either. The space on the cushion was just big enough. Worn fabric sagged slightly where it met the armrest, shaped by years of leaning and sitting. Courage placed one paw on the edge, testing it. No reaction. Another paw followed, and then he lifted himself slowly, careful not to make the springs creak too much. The warmth of the chair met him immediately. A steady heat from where Eustace had been sitting. It was the kind of warmth that only comes from something lived in for a very long time. He turned in a slow circle, making himself smaller, and curled into the hollow beside Eustace's hip. The fit was snug, but not uncomfortable. Like the chair had been waiting for both of them to be in it at the same time. Eustace didn't speak, didn't move away, but after a few moments, his arms settled back along the armrest, close enough that Courage could feel the faint weight of it in the air. The TV flickered, casting soft bursts of color across the room. Neither of them moved much. Courage could hear the steady hum of Eustace's breathing, not the sharp sighs he made when he was irritated. Just a slow, even rhythm that rose and fell without hurry. The cushion dipped slightly beneath them, pulling them a little closer together. Courage could feel the faint vibration of the chair springs whenever Eustace shifted his weight. Muriel's humming in the kitchen slipped in and out of the quiet, like the house itself was breathing along with them. For a while, Courage kept his eyes on the TV. He didn't really follow what was playing. The soft voices blurred into background sound, but he liked the way the light moved across the edges of the chair. At one point, Eustace shifted just enough that his arm rested along the back of the chair, not touching Courage, but making the space feel smaller, safer. They didn't look at each other. They didn't speak, but the silence had changed. Less like an empty room, more like something quietly shared. Courage shifted just enough to rest his head against the curve of the cushion. The fabric was worn smooth there, soft from years of use, and it held the warmth of Eustace's side. The steady rise and fall of Eustace's breathing became a quiet anchor in the background. It wasn't the sound of someone watching for trouble, or bracing for something unpleasant. It was just the sound of someone sitting, present and still. Outside, the wind brushed faintly against the siding of the house, but never hard enough to rattle it. The clock ticked from the hallway, marking the minutes in soft, even beats. Courage's eyelids grew heavier. Every so often, Eustace shifted his weight, and the movement sent a gentle wave through the cushion beneath them, reminding Courage he wasn't alone. It wasn't the kind of comfort he knew from Muriel. Warm, spoken, openly given. This was different. Quiet, almost hidden, but real enough that it settled into Courage's chest. He let his breathing match Eustace's without thinking about it, each inhale and exhale falling into the same unhurried rhythm. The chair had never felt this big before, or this safe. The light from the TV grew dimmer as the program changed, colors slowing into longer, gentler shifts. Courage's breathing stayed in rhythm with Eustace's, each rise and fall blending with the creak of the old chair. His eyes closed fully now, but the warmth beneath and beside him kept the shape of the moment in place. The steady weight of the cushion, the faint scent of old fabric, and the faintest trace of Eustace's cologne from long ago. Muriel's footsteps moved softly in the kitchen, but she didn't come in. Maybe she'd seen them like this once before and knew not to disturb it. Outside, the wind had faded, leaving the night in a kind of hush that seemed to settle over everything. The house, the chair, and the two of them sitting in it. Courage's head dipped lower against the cushion. His last waking thought was that the chair didn't feel quite like Eustace's anymore. Not entirely. Tonight it felt like theirs. Eustace didn't move him, didn't say a word, and the moment stretched quietly on, carried into the slow drift of sleep. And so the old chair creaked softly in the dark, holding the weight of two souls who didn't need words to understand each other. In the quiet of that nowhere night there was no rush, no reason to move, and no space for fear to slip in. Some moments are loud and unforgettable. Others are small, so small you might miss them if you aren't looking closely. But those are the ones that last the longest. The moments where nothing is said, and yet everything is given. As the house settled into stillness, the wind faded into a far-off hum, and the ticking clock became the only sound. The chair kept its warmth, and the space between Eustace and Courage held more than either of them would say out loud. So tonight, wherever you are, may you find a chair that's just big enough, a quiet that's just soft enough, and a moment that's just warm enough to carry with you into sleep. Good night, And may your dreams be full of small kindnesses that lasts until morning.